All right, welcome to the August 1st OMR Architecture Meeting. So today, Erwin will be taking us on a discussion around the source code formatting, something we've discussed in the past, but maybe some aspects of that could be revisited in 2024. So I'll turn it over to Erwin to take us through that.
Sure, yeah. So, there was an attempt in the past that to format the source code. It was mostly driven by the JIT side of things, because the JIT code format is not in any form that most JIT developers care about. But I suppose for consistency, I think it was Philip who was looking into it. He applied it across the whole code base. And then there was a lot of churn, and there were pushbacks in the community and whatnot. So I figure that it's probably still worth discussing at some point again, with being now, I suppose. But the feeling I get is that given what ended up happening in the past, and given that most of this is driven by the compiler, I think we should probably, I don't know how feasible it is, but the point that I wanted to come across was that maybe we should just apply this to the components that care rather than across the whole code base, because then that way you're sort of listening to the community. So for example, if the GC and the VM feel like their code format is fine, but the JIT component doesn't like it, then maybe we should just apply it to the component that actually has the problem and leave the components that don't. And then that way you don't have a community-wide sort of problem. That also means, though, that it doesn't quite make sense then in that case to implement things like JIT hooks, because what are you going to do? Just apply the code formatting automatically on part of the code base and not all of it, right? So it might just be something where that if we go down that road, you apply it on the files that you care to, specifically it would be JIT files, or we take the entire compiler directory and say apply it on everything one time, have this big commit in the history, and then go from there.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So are you talking about, so there's maybe a couple of things you could be talking about here. One is choosing a consistent look and feel for the structure of the source code throughout OMR, or are you talking about having some kind of an automated or some kind of tooling framework that actually does that formatting for you, or both?
Both. So originally it was going to be something where, okay, well, if you don't want to learn a new, if you want to have your own format in your IDE, you could just sort of create your commit, and then there could be Git hooks that would run and format it according to the standards of the code base. But that was one option among others. One of them being, well, your history is now going to have this big every file touched commit that is going to ruin Git blame and whatever. But it was just a matter of which one we want to go down. And what I'm talking about now is that if the consensus is format the component that has a problem, then it doesn't make sense to have a tool to do it for you on an ongoing basis. You can use a tool to do the formatting for you once, and then that's your new initial commit of sorts, right? I guess the point of this meeting was to discuss, are people okay with having OMR-wide changes? Is there going to be the same level of pushback and churn as last time? Because there's no point doing any sort of effort into it if the community itself has strong opinions about it.
Just to address one point that you made there, that I'm not sure if this was the case whenever we talked about this last, like 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember when it was even. I think there was some concern about the Git history being polluted in some way.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there is a way with Git blame that you can tell it to skip certain commits. Right. So
okay.
you can and you don't even have to type it. It'll automate. You put it into a file somewhere. It'll skip over if you do all the formatting changes in one go.
Right.
you can skip over that and get blamed. So that shouldn't be, you shouldn't be.
I have no problem with it. Like I personally, I'm okay with, like, for me, I'm also at this point just trying to be pragmatic. So that's why I'm even suggesting we don't have to format all of OMR, right?
Yeah.
Because especially in that case, the JIT is the one that has a decent amount of concern with our coding style. If the other parts don't, and they feel like this would add to this would actually impede their development in some way, or their experience that they've gotten used to, then we shouldn't impose a penalty on the rest of them for something that we want to change.
The source, maybe this isn't ideal, but the source code in OMR right now, like from a component point of view, even just the architecture point of view is different, right? The way that the compiler is put together is different than GC and the port library, which those things can be built standalone, whereas the JIT can, or the compiler part of it can't. So there's already sort of architectural and philosophical differences there, and that also happens to be where the source code syntax, the look and feel of that is different as well. So the fact that you apply something to part of the code base and not the entire thing might be a reasonable stepping stone. It's not like it's. I don't think you're breaking too many precedents by doing that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a new situation that the compiler code is formatted differently from the other code.
Yeah, and this also wouldn't cause as much churn in the community in the sense that people who don't work on the compiler are not going to have a problem with this, because aside from maybe the history situation, which you're saying is not a problem anyways.
So in terms of the format, I think one of the, if I remember correctly, when we had this discussion, we were presented with a variety of different alternative formats, and I think one of the ones being explored and perhaps even endorsed by a number of people or liked by a number of people definitely moved away from the way that the Testarossa code is formatted right now, more toward the style that the rest of the GC and the portlib is formatted. It's very similar to that. I think it did use spaces instead of tabs, though, which I think is that's probably going to be a contentious point as well. But in terms of just if you looked at the code, it would look much more similar to that. And I think and I don't want to speak for anybody at all on the team, because everybody has their own opinion on this, but just from my feeling, I think many people I don't think really care too much about what the source code looks like or how it's formatted. I think the Testarossa style is definitely a bit unusual. It's not really something that you see in a lot of other code bases. So moving to an alternate style, I don't think would be a big leap for some people. Like it just isn't something that would get in their way of their productivity or anything like that. That's my opinion.
Yeah, the only reason I'm even suggesting only doing it on a component basis is because there were people who had strong concerns in the past about their components being impacted. And so whether it was a real or perceived impact on for whatever reason they had a problem with it, it was still a problem, right? So I know that the compiler team, for the most part, having talked to a lot of people and also having seen what happened in the past, most compiler devs don't care. They if they can get used to Whitesmith or whatever this thing is, they can get used to a more sane style pretty quickly. I am not a fan of the space versus tabs debate. Like, we pick one and I don't care which one it is. So that sort of just deviates from the real point of we just need to get a consistent, a coding style that's at least something that newcomers are not going to be jarred at when they look at. Like a part of adoption also would be like, hey, you see something that looks like Linux kernel or something else, you're more likely to just be like, oh, this is something I'm used to seeing, as opposed to just my mind now has to get used to, the new style and whatnot, and there is minor overheads to all that stuff. So that's the reason for doing it. But I don't think that I would be against doing it in the whole code base, just given how the last attempt worked. It's not worth the problems that came up in the community because of it. Especially if you're saying that there's not going to be that much of a, like, if it doesn't improve productivity that much, change it. Then there's also the case to be made that why change it at all, right? So,
well, I said that I don't think that productivity would be impacted
right.
by changing it. I think that if there were some automated ways of keeping the code formatted, that would potentially reduce some of the back and forth that happens in some of the reviews of some of these commits, where you don't have to worry about white space, or there needs to be something after that brace and that kind of thing. Not that happens a lot, but still, it's just some back and forth churn that perhaps doesn't need to happen.
Yeah.
Something very easily automated out. So.
I wondered. I mean, if it is automatic formatting applied to the compiler only, why wouldn't that be something that we would apply automatically on an ongoing basis?
Basically, if we only apply it to the compiler, why couldn't we have automation only for the compiler? And that way, other components that like their format are not impacted by the automation.
Yeah.
Sorry,
you can do it that way. I suppose. Is your concern? Is your comment more about, like, of course we can do it that way, or is it about the fact that we would automate it on every check-in?
So
that's a little bit more contentious, right? Because would it be? Like, you want to be sure of what you're checking in is what you have written, right?
Well, one of the ideas was that you could install these hooks on your Git instance that would run it so that it's your commit, and not when you open a PR, it's running on GitHub. So that way you could run it and you could validate that this is still your changes. And
so does everybody then have to use? So where would, like, for example, assume you're talking about using like Clang format for doing this?
You would just,
so that everyone
the
have
code
to install
base could
Clang?
have the config file, and then you would just need to, the config file would be in the code base itself. You would just point Clang format to it and say, hey, apply this, please.
Well, where does Clang format run? On the GitHub?
I'm thinking that, like, if to address your concern about you want to make sure it's your commit, you would run it yourself, right? Maybe you would add it as part of your GitHub. I think Devin had, like, when this first came up, I think he had provided logic for how the hooks can be configured on your instance, like your local machine.
Sounds familiar, yeah.
I think you mean Philip.
I thought you had done it. I guess Philip had done it then.
I did different GitHub stuff for a different reason at a different time.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm mixing it up.
Assuming that this hook that we're talking about can be made to work on all platforms that people might develop on, that means Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and I'm not sure what else there might be. It doesn't answer the question of what happens when somebody who isn't or hasn't installed those hooks opens a pull request and the code isn't formatted. Like, whose job is it to recognize that there's some work that needs to happen and then make it happen?
Can you have a job that
I mean, you
CI
could have a
job that
linter.
actually runs Clang format.
Yeah, you could
check.
run a linter on the components that format that are supposed to adhere to this format, and then I guess at least the linter will then complain that you're not meeting the formatting standards, as opposed to a committer himself or herself.
So you're talking about it, like the line end job that we have, something similar that would check the formatting?
Yeah, something like that. You could, I think, run Clang format as the linter job.
As I remember last time, what's a problem with runs this tool, for example, from Eclipse, and it's just only like command line only. So people using different tools to develop code. So we need to cover all of them as well.
Yeah, it kind of expands on my platform comment. So yeah, all platforms, but all IDEs that people choose to use.
Yeah, I guess you're saying that those hooks wouldn't work well with eGit.
Well, I mean, so if you get the code into a good shape to begin with,
Yeah, then it's not a problem.
then you're just making incremental changes on top. Like that's the problem right now, right?
Yeah,
People having to make, and it's just that the linter that runs when you check in happens to catch you and report it that this code is not formatted according to the standards. I would think that we need to have some kind of way of overriding that because, for example, I think one of the problems in the JIT, at least, was that there were some very carefully formatted, complex, carefully formatted pieces of code that if we were to allow those formatting rules to apply would screw everything up. And we want to make sure that that code stayed in a certain shape.
I think there were pragmas you could add.
Right. So are there ways of or telling the linter exclude?
I mean, I think that if you have the pragmas there, then the first time you apply it, the source code formatting, it would not apply it to those regions. And then the linter would also see the same pragmas and not expect that those regions should be formatted, right? Because I think a way of doing the formatting would be you would run Clang format on your diff, and if there was a difference, then you would complain, right? It wouldn't be that, like you would, like a simple way is just like run Clang format on your code base, and it should be enough because you're already in the right format. And if it isn't, then it would complain and say, hey, white space at the end, or blah, 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 whatever. So in that way, the pragmas would be respected in that world.
Do you have any experience with Clang format?
I've never run it. I literally did not. I saw how the last one went, and I'm like, well, wait, I need some cooling down time. But the point of this meeting was to see if there was any significant issue with just the compiler component. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are driving this. Because I know that that's also not ideal from a unified OMR point of view.
Well, yeah, I'm not. I mean, in an ideal world, yes. I mean, not only should the code look the same, but the design philosophy of the entire thing should look the same. And we're not close to solving even that part of it. So, and if making some changes like this would help with the overall consumability of the code and some kind of productivity improvement, then I might be in favor of that. I guess we do seem to have a fairly diverse set of people on the call, which is awesome for today. I'm wondering what kinds of problems what are some of the challenges with running source code formatting on code being delivered? Like you talked about some of these problems that people had before. What are those still issues, or?
I don't know. It wasn't anyone on the compiler side who brought up some of these things. So I don't know if some of those people are
Are they all documented in the
It's
issue?
on the issue. It's that one big issue that I don't think that was a committer vote issue, but there was an issue that let me see if I can find it.
I'm a little bit surprised at the connection or the suggested connection between formatting and what you refer to as architecture. In the latter, I'm assuming you're talking about how the make files work and how or CMake files, work, whatever. But I would see those two, the formatting and the build structure as mostly independent things. Or am I misunderstanding what you mean?
What I was saying was more like if you look at the difference between the GC and OMR and the compiler, the GC can be built into its own sort of standalone module that gets driven by a config file, whereas the way that the compiler was done, it's not standalone. It has to be built into something. You have to take all those classes and then connect them into some kind of a project that extends from it, and then you can build that thing into into a compiler. So those are two different architectural directions that, for whatever reason, we took when this code was open sourced, and that's sort of the way things are right now. So that's the architectural divide that I'm referring to, not really on the make. I mean, that does affect make files, I guess, and CMake files, but that's what I was more referring to.
So I guess I'm still unclear why you bring these two topics together.
I think there's just two examples of things where we haven't unified the view of those things across the whole code base. So
Yeah, I understand that,
on.
but sure, maybe we want to tackle those two problems, but maybe one at a time, unless there's a connection that I don't understand.
So Mark was echoing the same thoughts that I had, which was it was giving an example of another aspect of OMR where there are differences in, like, fairly significant differences in some kind of design and between components. And the formatting difference is yet another kind of difference that we just have that we're currently tolerating. So it won't be too out of character for this code base if part of it did something some way and then another part of the code did something another way. That doesn't mean that we're abandoning any sort of intent to try to bring things together at some point in the perhaps distant future, but it's really just reflecting the reality of where we are right now and what kind of work is being done on this code base.
I suppose if we focus on the compiler component, at least we're not introducing a third code formatting, right? Like we're changing one of the two into another thing, as opposed to introducing yet a third thing that would then not be uniform across, at least not making things worse.
Right.
It's not going in the wrong direction necessarily. It's just that it may not be completely solving the problem that you'd like to solve, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe we don't have to solve that one entirely. Who knows? I mean,
Yeah, and with the oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Devin.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and with the choice of a brace style or such, it could, if not be the same, it could more closely resemble the style of the other code in OMR than the current compiler style does.
Yep, agreed. So it's you're right. It's a little bit better than just maintaining status quo. You're right.
And to Daryl's original point, the linter would at least prevent the committer from being, hey, you've missed a thing. It would point it out. The committer would say, fix the linter problems. The committer doesn't even have to look at spacing or anything.
So would we have a policy on, so pull request shows up, it's got 5 commits in it, and the linter thing fails. Is the contributor expected to fix the linter problems on each individual commit, or have one commit at the end that fixes everything, or
what is our expectation right now for the line endings? Do we want it to be a final commit, or do we, because it's sort of the same
Yep.
thing? I know for the copyright, it was a bit trickier because you kind of had to, I mean, we would do it as one commit, but technically you were supposed to do it for each.
Right.
But for the line endings and these things, it's not really as legally, so,
Yeah.
I don't know. You guys have been committed longer than me. What do your feel?
Well, I mean, I find good hygiene attractive, but at the same time, that also puts a higher burden on contributors to run the tool on every commit individually and rebase like merge the changes, squash the changes together on individual commits, which is probably not. It probably doesn't help with kind of making the project more attractive. I don't know. Does anyone else on the call have?
So I'm not really sure. I kind of thought about the topic of, having the rules apply to each individual commit before. We haven't done so with the line ending check. If the final thing looks good, then, we don't so much worry about the stuff in the middle. But I'm with Mark that, that kind of lack of hygiene in the middle is unwelcome from my perspective, but it's livable. Right?
I
Yeah,
think
maybe. Sorry,
that
Devin,
I think I don't mind too much if there's some little difference in the middle of a series of commits where it's not quite formatted 100% to the standard of however it's supposed to be. But I think what would bother me is that then if the full series of commits ends up at a point where it is formatted that way, then there's very likely to be unrelated formatting changes in later commits, or some extra formatting commit that that will kind of clog up the history. It's not like the big one reformat that you can ignore in a blame config file or something if you're running into a situation with any kind of frequency where there's this extra formatting commit and we want to ignore all of them.
But even right now, when you as a reviewer make a suggestion or make a request, you must change the white space here or format this differently. I don't know what others have experienced, but I think people tend to not create a new commit for that. They actually go through and they rebase it and fix the individual commits. That's not how.
I think that's how I would do it.
You would add one commit at the end?
I don't change the code, but no, I'm not a fan of adding a commit at the end for partially the reason that that Devin just mentioned, and also just because I find that mildly distasteful. It's not taking care of the code in a way, but like Keith said, I can tolerate it. It's not. I don't think it's essential because it's not that frequently, at least that I would look at the individual commits in a PR. I'd be more likely to look at them as a unit.
I mean, I guess it would be how is that any different than what we're doing today, basically, right? You have two ways of fixing it today. In the end, the check is going to pass, right? So
yeah. Well, I mean, even reviewer comments happen that way too. I'm not a big fan of the one commit that addresses all the reviewer commits either, but people do it. Like it's not.
Wouldn't it make it into a history as well? So if we go through a commit history of a file just to see what changes have been made, we'll see a bunch of those kind of commits like fixing spaces or copyright.
Yeah, right. I mean, fundamentally, who cares when the spaces got changed in the code if you're trying to, no one's looking at the history to find out when the spaces got added, right? They're looking at the history to find out when particular code changes were happening in particular parts of the code base. That's what you want the history to reflect. strong position on that, right? That applies beyond code formatting, I think, right?
Yeah, and so to Mark's point, if there's an extra commit at the end to deal with all the formatting fixes, then when you look at the history, what you'll see first is that formatting change, but that's not really what you care about. It's the
Right.
structural change that happened in an earlier commit. And so
I
don't
think
know.
of, oh,
I don't know
sorry.
if it's worth enforcing it, but I like Mark's suggestion of having the formatting, having the check be that every commit has it right.
Does
I don't know if
Does
the linter
revert-
does that right now, though.
does revert only operate on full like a whole pull request version? Like, if
No,
you
revert
revert a pull
happens
request,
per commit.
so is there any impact on reverting when you try, like when you want to revert the structural change, but the code formatting thing has happened in since, does that cause any? I'm just asking because I haven't done it. So does that cause
Yeah,
any?
you have to revert the formatting change and then the change with the structural change,
Yeah. Okay.
which another reason.
So it does start to get uglier. Yeah.
We don't want
It
that.
starts to add up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
think line ending test runs on a per commit basis. I think it runs on.
Maybe it
the
should. Then,
It
right?
runs
I mean, I
on-
think that's what we're discussing really is, do we want to, as part of this discussion, come to a conclusion, do we want to drive hygiene a little bit harder? And is that gonna provide a significant benefit for anyone? And is it gonna cause, more pain for contributors, right? I guess that's kind of the thing we're balancing against all of the issues that we've been calling out.
Yeah, I think that if the lint does apply to each commit individually, and if we have a commit hook that is usable by all of the regular contributors, so that this happens automatically on every commit, then I think that the situation where the lint finds a problem, even if it's looking at every commit, would be rare. And that could even potentially be something where we could provide like a script or something to someone who has, run afoul of it and say like, well, run the script and, maybe it could reformat the stuff and kind of show what the differences are, or something. It did. I guess all I mean to say is that the formatting is automated in this scenario after all, right?
I think that's an important piece of this is that it can be automated by everybody who chooses to do so. If you want to do it manually, that's up to you, but we'll give people the option to do it automatically.
So I think this is a question I asked the last time around. I mean, Daryl raised the general worry of the sort of like there are these, for better or for worse, there are these parts of the compiler code base that have complex conditional nests where the formatting of the text is helpful to make sure you're understanding what's actually being tested in the condition. Do we know how prevalent? I'm pretty sure Philip would have gone and looked at this because that's the kind of thing he would have done at the time, but I don't remember the answer. Has anyone seen any? Do you have a feeling for how many places these pragmas would be introduced into the code base just to preserve the formatting of some complex conditional
I think
corp?
all of those were in the optimizer.
Most of them, from what Andrew Craig had said, his concerns were always these optimizer
Right.
queries.
Right.
And I think they might be easy to spot if you just page through the code because they would be either fairly deeply nested or deeply nested ifs or really intense loop condition formatted in just a certain way, right? Like 10 lines of ORs.
Yeah.
So if
In
you
my
take-
view, things like this should give a committer pause and go like, do you really need to have this 10-line condition here? Is there not a better way to express this so that, you know, the formatter can do his job and we not lose sight of what's going on?
I
Yeah,
think
that
this
was
is
my
for-
better or worse comment. That's or
I think this
I was
is
trying to get to that, but
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think for new code it should be allowed, but this is existing code where it would
yeah, we don't.
be very
We
hard
want to be
to-
very careful about disrupting those those
Yeah.
pieces of code.
So
at
anything
this
new
point.
for sure should not, you know, a committer would say you can't do this, but there's unfortunately lots of code that already exists that does this.
Yeah, sorry, and what I meant by that was not, like, I don't care if some automated tool goes and changes the white space around some complex conditional nest. I care about a developer sitting there and trying to figure out what are the pieces of this, like, how do I take this one line thing that's really split over 12 lines of code and split it into a more, like, decompose it into a more, you know, structurally helpful piece of code, right? That's a recipe for getting it wrong. You have to be extremely careful when you do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and so my comment
can be
was
very tricky.
more about after all this is done and somebody comes with a new pull request that introduces a new place where it says turn off the formatter for this section. I think that's a kind of a red flag for a committer. It goes like, we shouldn't need to do this.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, unless it's a really good reason.
Well,
but-
particularly if it's new code, I guess. But I mean, I think that pragmatically, maybe I did come into this conversation a little bit in the middle, so forgive me if I missed something that was said earlier, but and saying therefore something stupid. But I mean, I think one way this might roll out would be to do a commit that changes, like, that formats everything in the new format, you know, all kind of in one go. Yes, that has the downside of showing up in everybody's get blame report, but at least it's stuck in one commit.
No, we talked about it, and Daryl said there's a way to have Git blame
Ignore that
Yeah.
commit. Okay, fine. So everything changes at once, and then I think there's probably, like, you know, but we're not going to know necessarily where all those pragmas should be for that particular commit. So I think there's likely to be, you know, as a discovery process, you know, people on Henry's team, people on, you know, who are digging through the optimizer are going to come across some of these places where, like, holy shit, what the hell is this doing? And I can't decode it because it's in the auto formatted thing, and I'll probably go back to the original code before that commit and put it back and then put the pragmas in. So I think there's likely to be sort of a process of discovery of these things that matter for the code that we're changing right now, where I think we have to accept that, you know, there may be some situations where it's just smarter to introduce the pragmas than it is to force the person who's trying to put the pragmas in to refactor the code into a nicer looking series of conditionals. But beyond that, I think I agree with what Keith was saying. Like, I do agree that the smell, definitely, code smell, definitely. And it might be one of those things where, not that we're short of issues that nobody's working on, but, you know, if somebody puts a pragma around a piece of code, that's, to me, a red flag that there should be an issue for somebody to look at that. And if it becomes an important issue for someone to work on, or if somebody new to the project, you know, gets really thinks they can take on one of those conditions as a contribution to the project, you know, like that kind of a thing doesn't necessarily require in deep runtime VM compiler knowledge to refactor code, as long as you're smart at refactoring code. It's just there is that risk, obviously, of, you know, making sure that we don't screw anything up when we do it. That falls on the committers, I guess.
Yeah, with C, C++ and lazy evaluation, that whole thing is very, very hard to actually refactor.
Yeah, I got you. But I mean, so those conditional nests are, you know, like, yes, they're structured so that someone can work their way through the conditions that are actually happening, and yes, there's a reliance on some of those kinds of effects, those conditional effects. But I think you're really just in your head when you're going through it, you're kind of coming up with what's the variable name that this part of the condition should really be computing. And then why is it, this or that or this and like you're not going to change the conditional structure of the thing. You're just going to put some names in the middle so that you can read it more legibly, right? And not have to keep it all in your head as you're decoding 12 lines of conditional GORP. Right? I mean, I think that would be the purpose in refactoring it from my point of view. I think just making it easier for someone to just read the code and understand what it's doing and putting the conditions together. But that's all. I mean, the other thing you have to we all have to recognize that's value from a technical debt perspective, but it's not doing anything new. It's making code that works continue to work, just be a little bit more maintainable. And not that that isn't a valuable thing, but it's not the only thing. I don't want to get stuck in a world where we're just fixing technical debt either.
Another question that comes up is how do we have this play with dependent projects? So, for example, OpenJ9 has a big compile component, which will now be in a different format than this compiler component. Do we have and there's other projects that use OMR, so. But this is going to happen whether we did OMR just a compiler component, or OMR the whole project. Like, it was still a problem no matter what. Do you remember what the plan was back when this was first attempted?
Well, I mean, I think it's just a communication. Communicate with the different communities. It's really only one plus some internal IBM stuff. And we just talk about what it's going to mean for the downstream. I would like to believe that it's. I don't know if I have to like to believe it. I'm pretty sure the people who work on the OMR compiler component are the same people who are working on the OpenJ9 compiler component. So I don't foresee any great resistance to coming up with a new code format that's acceptable to OMR and acceptable to OpenJ9. And that solves probably 98% of your risk of doing things differently. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised if somebody in the OpenJ9 community would, jump up and down if we were to change the compiler format. If we talk to the people in the OMR project, or who are reachable from the OMR project, here's what we're proposing to do. Community, give us your feedback. That's going to be primarily the people in Toronto, but I'm sure the people, as we found out here, there are people in Ottawa who have opinions about it too, and that's great. And I think the same is going to be true for OpenJ9, and we should probably do that at more or less the same time, right? But feedback in OMR, then you post something in OpenJ9 saying, hey, it looks like OMR is doing this thing. Does anybody want to, redirect people there to have the conversation, I guess, in OMR? And then, unless there's an OpenJ9 specific aspect to it, I guess. Like, specific to J9, I can't imagine it really, right? Honestly. And then you've got people like Kevin on the call for some of the internal stuff. He can represent that opinion. He's listening. He can speak for himself. Nobody needs to put words in his mouth.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, from that perspective, like I don't see any problem with having a code format change in OMR and enforcing that change for contributions that are going into OMR. It doesn't have any direct effect on the rest of the code that is interacting with that that's being consumed.
Right.
So that seems like I've been as I'm tracking the discussion, I think it sounds like this is moving in a direction that makes sense to me, which is why I haven't piped in yet. So as a contributor, I think it sounds reasonable. as well. So and not a terrible burden, especially given that the plan includes some like automation to help the formatting happen as you're working.
Right. Great. Thanks, Kevin. That's the answer I expected you to give, but I'm I didn't, like I said, I didn't want to put words in your mouth. So thanks for expressing it.
Sure thing. Appreciate it.
So I mean, we can continue to discuss obviously if people have more concerns and questions, but
I guess to just summarize, I think where we're at before we go further, the idea is to format the compiler. Well, first get feedback that we're on the community that we want to format just a compiler component. Figure out from what Philip had done before and relook at some of those. Well, assuming the examples are still around, which they may not be, and I may have to generate them myself. So I'll look into that, see if I can generate the examples in the compiler component for the various. I think it was either Mozilla or WebKit. I can't remember which. One of them was very close to both what people liked and also relatively close to the J9 VM side of things.
Yeah, just spaces rather than tabs.
Yeah, which again that can be added into the thing if we really wanted to, right? I think it's just a format file, like probably a JSON or some kind of file that specifies what it is. So do that, get feedback, and then provide that config file. Probably contribute that config file into the repo, and also provide I don't know if we want to add the Git hook logic into the repo as well. It's something where if people wanted to add the Git hooks into their own commits, they could. And then maybe a script that Devin was talking about to help people see their changes. But that would sort of be the path forward. And to clarify, just the compiler component. So that's sort of where I think we've settled on.
Right. So one other practical consideration is picking a time when you're kind of in the middle of everyone's release cycles. You don't like go and change the code formatting the day before we split for some update release or something like that.
No, I mean,
or,
I think,
or potentially, just derail something like a release. That's all.
I think that if we do all of the prototyping work and make sure everything is fine and do the testing, then it's just a matter of triggering it at a point when it's okay and everyone is reasonably happy with it.
So, but there's I guess that's true, right? So if you have all the automated stuff attached to the pull request, then it doesn't really matter that people have. I guess people will have to do a rebase on any existing
changes that
branch that they've got to basically accept the code formatting.
But
that could be painful, though, right?
Well, yes and no. I think if you contribute the change the files that specify the new format before they rebase, they should just take that config file, run blank format on their stuff.
Right. Okay. So
then,
yeah. Right. So we document the process by which we recommend people to.
Yeah. that way, at least the rebase is a bit cleaner now.
If you have an existing branch, do this first, and then before you submit. Yeah.
And then rebase. Yeah. Then it's fine.
And then rebase. Yeah.
So next OMR release is September 30th, just FYI. You're looking for something to line up with, and then December 31st is the next one. So it might be good to line up with one of those if you're, or a release of some sort.
You also have to ask at OpenJ9 because OpenJ9 is not taking OMR releases, right? They're taking individual commits.
Yeah.
Like they're essentially tagging. I don't think they tag, but they're essentially tagging a commit.
Just in terms of
Sorry, go ahead.
in terms of timing with the things like release branches, I think it might be better to do it before splitting a release branch than soon after, because then that could complicate cherry picking later changes on fixes onto the release branch.
Yeah.
Fair point. Yeah, I was more focusing on the disruption of, like, the potential disruption of having this big, massive commit all of a sudden land on you and you're not expecting it for a release. I think we know all the people who are building releases off of OMR. We can coordinate that.
Okay, Erwin, I think you were saying something.
I'm not sure it was important because I lost it. But it might have just been along the lines of the releases you mentioned. I think it'll have to just be the latter one, because we would still need to do the whole, even though we had the discussion here, have a formal, for OMR, do we still need a formal issue for people to post on, or is this silence considered consent? I don't, like, on the OMR side. I know an OpenJ9 will have, or maybe the issue is needed so that we can point to OpenJ9 and say, hey.
Well, I guess the question is, do we, I hate to ask this question because I know where it's going to go, but do we know what the code format is that we would, like, are we going to take the results of the older?
No, if the whole reason we started this up again is that, hey, the parties and the players have changed, we should provide an option again and see if the same thing was settled on as last time, right? In terms of, again,
can we start with, like, have one of the options be, here's where we were
yeah.
after the last discussion on this, and we sort of landed mostly here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the one that I'll probably say this is the
does anyone have a serious reason to not choose? Like, I don't know, there's a possibility we could just endlessly discuss all the details of the coding format, and I'm not sure that if there's somebody who feels strongly about a particular element of the coding format, then fine, we can have that discussion. But I kind of not like to descend into another code format discussion.
Yeah, the only problem
that'll take months and.
I mean, what I can do is say, this is the code format we are thinking of to use anyone, not offer any other alternatives. Right. Just say, this is what it is. Does anyone have any serious concerns?
Right.
If there is a tabs versus space thing, I'm sure the config file can be modified appropriately. Just then use tabs.
You can point to the previous discussions as well. If people want to read through.
Well, I don't know if
where we ended up. This is where we ended up.
Philip had generated them. I don't know if
it doesn't have to be the branches, just the text.
The discussion
discussions of what has occurred, because we don't want to rehash a lot of that.
Like I don't want to force everybody to go back and reread everything that we've ever said about code formatting, topic. That's a lot of stuff to spend time reading and absorbing and reasoning about, thinking about. We did get to a basic place, so let's kind of start there and see if there's any real objection to just doing that. And if there is, fine, we'll have the discussion. But if there isn't, that probably accelerates moving forward.
Okay. I'll open an issue just pointing to the previous one, and if the code examples are not still available, I'll just run it on.
For the specific thing that we landed on.
Yeah, for the specific thing. Okay. I mean, I might land it anyway, because the code base has changed considerably from what it was before, so I might as well do it now.
Right. Oh, you mean pre-run, like build a branch that has the formatted code in it.
Yeah, just so people can go look at it. Because I think that's what Philip had offered before.
Right.
He had done 3 or 4 different branches.
Yep. Yeah, I think that was quite helpful, actually, for evaluating the differences between the different options. I mean, also for what it's going to look like. People can.
I think I have to confess I'm a little disappointed that this seems to have narrowed in scope to just the JIT component. Does anybody think this would be a bad idea to extend to the rest of the OMR code base at some point?
I do. I do for sure.
Yeah, I think the reason why I started off with just the compiler was that given how strongly people felt the first time around, I figure, you know what, let's just start on the component that had the least amount of pushback, and then if we want to expand, we could do it on the whole code base. But at some point, I was coming at this from a purely pragmatic point of view, given the previous approach was the idealist approach. This is now just a pragmatic approach where I'm not I'm not really interested in going down the full drama-filled path. It's better we just do something useful. And for the most part, I know the compiler devs have the biggest problem with our code base, just from a aesthetic point of view, not so much from a what's the word I'm looking for, performance point of view. Because like at the end of the day, we're all used to it. But there was a lot of pushback from non-compiler components, and so in order to respect the community's desire, where some of us want it and some of us don't, this just seemed like a pragmatic compromise.
Yeah, I understand this. I understand this is a first step, but are we thinking there's going to be a second step or no second step that extends it to the rest of the code base?
I guess that depends on the rest of the components.
I don't think taking one step prevents us from taking more than one step, but I think we should take the one step.
Unless the one step is a step that the other components would not want to follow. Like,
I suppose, but I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think the components who wouldn't follow the new format are also not happy with the existing format. So like they tolerate it because it's there. It's the one we chose, but I don't think I don't think they would be naturally happy with that format either. So this was kind of I don't think we're making things worse comment that I made before, but
I think you could also use this as just evaluate the different processes that like the automation processes to see how well they work. Like you don't necessarily want to do this everywhere.
Yeah.
Maybe this is just
most of the info would be in place, and then if other components wanted it, it would just be, formatted once and then update the paths to then include everything.
Yeah.
So I don't remember kind of what style that seemed to be the front runner last time we went through this. But I guess my hope would it would be something, not too far into what, the rest of OMR looks like. Maybe that would make it easier for, to adopt through the rest of the code base.
As I remember it, like the brace style is what the rest of OMR would use. I forget the name of that brace style, but the indentation was still spaces, but it was like 4 spaces rather than 3 or something like that. And there were some other aspects to it that, like the way that functions were indented was probably more similar to what standard C people would expect, that kind of thing. Is there any other significant aspects?
I think the other subtleties were in the conditionals.
How the conditionals got formatted. Yeah, so I don't know that. I don't know. Those parts didn't strike me as terribly. It's kind of one or the other, right?
I think the benefits of switching were so that because the problem is the Whitesmith style or whatever we use has not been codified in some config file, so it's hard to run a linter on it. Whereas once you change it to something that is
right,
like instead of spending the time of
then it becomes easier to evolve going forward if we wanted to, as long as people were willing to tolerate more changes.
But yeah, to key to your point, it was fairly close in at least when you look at it quickly to the J9, the rest of the J9 stuff, or the rest of the VM components and stuff. But like Mark said, I think it used spaces, which
I think the main difference is spaces. Well, main difference, but I think the spaces versus tabs was one of the key sort of, and that's a very philosophical topic for people, and I think that's one of the sort of dividing lines around it. So I'm not sure.
I mean, I think like I could probably do an experiment where I just modify that thing to say instead of 4 spaces, it's 1 tab or whatever.
I think that was one of the options. I think
that
Philip did one of those.
Did we settle on the space one or the tabs one?
We settled on the 4 spaces, I believe. Okay. I believe. I could be misremembering because it was a while ago.
It's just too wide.
Yeah. There's just too much depth in the optimizer. Although parts of the code, like I remember some of the CodeGen code too was kind of like that. Maybe it's gotten better. I don't know.
Yeah, we write crappy code too.
Yeah. No monopoly on crappy code. Fantastic. There's our tagline. Nobody has a monopoly on crappy code.
But okay, then maybe I'll just start with that, and then once I have that issue that just sort of describes the plan forward and also an example.
Yeah.
Maybe two examples. One, because the thing with tabs is that you can always specify the tab stop on your IDE, so it doesn't have to be as deep. Because then it would look no different than.
Yeah,
But
let's just let's not talk about tabs and spaces. Just don't even start.
So I mean, I can just do it with the one that was spaced and leave it alone at that. Because again, I don't care.
Let's pick the one where we ended up and just start from there. I really hope it doesn't devolve again into spaces versus tabs. But
I mean, someone will say something, but we don't have to necessarily. Like, if the majority don't care, then it's again.
Well, at least in the compiler, spaces are the status quo anyway, so it's just not a change
Right.
to choose spaces in the
Well,
compiler.
Mostly, you'll see contributions that have a few spaces, a tab, some more spaces, and like, what?
Yeah, occasionally, but
At least the formatter will then make it consistent.
Right,
Or
and
the linter will make it.
we can regulate that now.
Yeah. So one of the things that, and it's another step removed from OMR, I suppose, but keeping the OpenJ9 project in mind, we also deal with OpenJDK code, and sort of one of the things that, sort of from my IDE's perspective, that becomes challenging is, if I pick, tabs for indentation for most of the OpenJ9 code, that's great, but when I want to work on an OpenJDK code, well, it wants spaces, and maybe the same rule is going to apply to OMR, but it would be nice if they were all the same. Or maybe there's just a way to tell my IDE, this project uses spaces, this one uses tabs, and I just
I've
have to
noticed that with the VS Code, it will do what the file does. So
Yeah.
when I open VM files, and I press tab, it actually puts in a tab. But when I open compiler files and press tab, it actually puts spaces. So somehow it's smart enough to look at the average and say, this thing uses tabs.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with other IDEs, but I know in VS Code there is a setting where you can, which maybe is the default as you're describing, that you can turn on that tells it to do that, to auto detect.
Yeah, I've tried VS Code a few times, not a fan, so that's not my world.
Might be maybe that feature is available in other IDEs as well. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, so I have to dig in to see if Eclipse can do that, or I just have to create a .settings folder for each project I work in and tell it this one uses tabs, this one uses spaces.
Yeah, I mean, we can't be opinionated on what editor people use. So
Yeah.
I think we should be willing to support different editors and whatever configuration files needed for editors to be able to manage the code.
Yeah.
I think.
So it's the same kind of thing as, my settings for Vi are, to use tabs, and if I use Vi in OpenJDK code, I can make a mess pretty quickly.
All right, so before we turn Erwin loose on this, are there other opinions on this that haven't been expressed yet?
We do have OMR coding standards, which really describe most of this and how code should look like. And GC and OpenJ9 project entire really follow these rules. Would be nice if selected format kind of at least based on these rules.
Yeah, and where it doesn't align with sort of the general coding style, that document should be updated to say, if you're working in this area, these are the kind of adjustments to that style that apply.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah, I think the document is completely silent on the compiler code right now.
I'm pretty sure that document was a J9 document that was contributed as part of OMR. So it wasn't meant to be this is how all code in OMR should look. This is just basically documenting the code format that's used in a lot of OMR components. Yeah. I can't remember if it excluded does it mention the compiler component?
No, because it predates. that was
Oh, it
contributed.
predated the compiler
Yeah.
component being there, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
why.
So we should have reformatted it when we contributed, not kidding. Because that was the most important thing to do when we got the compiler component.
But I agree with you, Dimitri, that there have been some style disagreements that came up over the years that when, especially in the compiler, where there is no sort of standard documentation on how things should look. So I certainly think that style guide should reflect that. And even if there is any sort of automatic formatting that's happening in certain parts of the code, that it follows whatever those guidelines
I
are.
think having this claim format thing is a good way of like documenting what the expected format is in the compiler component, right? So at least, I mean, that is also a step forward, because right now there is no, I don't think, documentation of what is the expected. It's just kind of look at the code around it and use your best judgment, and that doesn't always work.
Does anybody know if Clang format can be told to fix like preprocessor directives, for example? You know, the OMR coding guide says on the end if you should have a comment that repeats the if condition, so that you know which if it matches without looking back a couple of pages, right?
Yeah.
Is that beyond the scope of what we think?
I like that requirement, actually. I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, but I don't. So my question is that
We'd have to
beyond the
look
scope of what Clang format can do?
I don't know. We should look into it, probably. That's a good question. I also think, just to sort of say it explicitly, I don't think we need to make this code format change and then calcify the code format forevermore, right? I mean, I think, enhancements like the one that Keith just mentioned, if we find that Clang format can do a thing that we all agree improves the format of the code, we should consider doing that, right? I think that's one of the benefits of getting an automated code formatting tool and description in place, is because it enables you to start thinking about, like you're not constrained by the amount of work it would be to make a change, right? It simplifies evaluating new options, and if you decide that something's going to improve your code base and the tool can do it, then it greatly simplifies getting from A to B.
One of the things that we did before we open sourced, at least the compiler part of the code, was run this include what you use on it, which really shrunk down the number of pound includes on the header and various files. So I suspect that we haven't been as diligent on that. So that's almost another thing that you could run on the code base as well, to try and minimize the number of pound includes. But it's not exactly a source code formatting. It's more of a,
What I found with JB2 is that the linker is not always good at identifying things that are defined in multiple places too, so that may even have an impact on the size of the library in some cases. But like various templates that appear in headers, I guess if you don't instantiate the template, it doesn't really matter. Maybe that's not a concern, but inline things in headers, for example, I assume it's the linker that would normally figure out that there's an inline version of this thing in all CPP files that included that header, and that they're all the same one. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, that kind of reminds me. I've never quite understood how the compiler doesn't complain about inline virtual functions in header files. Like, how does it know to only keep one copy of the implementation of that virtual function? Or am I wrong? There's really, multiple. Well, actually, there can't be multiple copies because the virtual function table can only point at one of them.
Right.
Which one?
Good question. And
I think the linker deduplicates them.
It's supposed to.
It may assume that they're identical even if they're not, because we have the one definition rule.
So that sounds mildly
Yeah.
scary, because if there are different ones, which one does it pick? That's, anyway.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah, I get it. I get it. I completely get it. Just stop scaring me.
But the other part of that is that, the author of that header file perhaps isn't aware that, it's not really inlined.
Yeah.
Although
All
for
right.
inline functions, you probably only have them lying around in your in kind of standalone form in your various object files if the compiler didn't inline them. If you compile a file that uses one and it has inlined all the uses, and it's not address taken or something, then I think it probably wouldn't generate one. Anyway, this is not related to formatting anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess last call for any formatting topics. Okay. If not, I guess we'll see an issue from Erwin that we can use to start to socialize this.
So are you going to share a link to that issue in the Slack channel, perhaps?
Yeah, when I open it. I'll probably put it in, I guess, OMR general, just because
Well, I'm referring to the public Slack channel.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. Don't just limit it to the compiler channel.
Yeah.
Even though the code formatting, the approach only applies to the compiler format. I think it's the whole community that should be aware of this, because it's going to have a bigger impact than just that.
Yeah, because their history is affected too.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks everyone for the discussion today. I think we made some forward progress here. And I think we can adjourn now. So thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.